Live from New Hampshire, it's time for the Science Cafe!
Learn about the latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Did we mention it's free?
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
So my name is Dan Marchek. I'm one of the founders of Science Cafe. How many of you have not been to a Science Cafe before? Wow, that's great. I did not organize this panel as I usually do. Sandy Belknap did, and I'm going to let her do the introductions of the panelists. This is the largest panel I think we've ever had, so hopefully everybody will get a chance to talk. And Sandy, how about telling us who they are?
Okay, so let's start with Nashua Police Department. We have Sergeant Patrick Hannon on the far left, and 2 seats over is Sergeant Robert Powers. Sergeant Hannon joined Nashua Police in 2005, and he's worked with the Detective Bureau as well as been a detective and detective sergeant since 2012, working in both special investigation and criminal investigation divisions. He's also been part of several homicide investigations, including the David Kaplan and Anthony Barnaby 1988 cold case that a lot of people in the Nashua area are aware of. Sergeant Powers joined Nashua Police in 2002. Since 2010, he's worked as a digital forensics examiner and helped to create the department's computer forensics unit. He has conducted hundreds of digital forensic examinations on computers, phones, and other digital evidence. And he testifies in both state and federal court regarding such evidence. He's also worked as a member of the Nashua Police Crime Scene Unit, so when you hear of anything big on the news, you see that unit around, he has been there. And he's currently assigned to the Criminal Investigation Division, where he supervises the Computer Forensics Unit and Crime Scene Unit. We'll introduce Mark Hastbacka next. He is with the FBI. He's a special agent with the Department of Justice. He's been with the agency since 1997 and has experience investigating violent crime and terrorism squads. His assignments have brought him with the FBI to Miami, Baghdad, and now in Bedford, New Hampshire. While in Miami, Mark investigated. It's a very dangerous place. But Mark investigated. This is really interesting. So talking about forensics, it's not all new like you're hearing about on CSI, but Mark worked on a case over 20 years ago called the Florida Four. It was a gun running case that actually influenced the Good Friday peace agreements with the Irish Republican Army. So he'll be talking about his experience and testifying against those cases and those criminals. We have Dr. Liz Karagosian. She is an emergency department physician with Southern New Hampshire Medical Center, and she's been part of the Southern New Hampshire Medical Center. It's called the SANE program, standing for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner, since it was incepted in 2008 and is now their medical director since 2012. If you didn't know, Southern New Hampshire Medical Center is one of the only hospitals in the state of New Hampshire with a 24/7 on-call forensic services and annually sees 150 to 200 cases annually for sexual assault, domestic violence, child and elder abuse. Dr. Karagosian is also a board member of Bridges Domestic and Sexual Violence Support Group of Greater Nashua. We have Dawn Reams as well. She's the executive director for that organization, if you'd like to talk to her later. And she also serves on the New Hampshire Attorney General's Sexual Assault Advisory Board. So we have the storytellers. So we have the investigators and now the storytellers for tonight. So Tim Pilleri and Lance, I'm sorry, Lance, I didn't catch your last name. Reenstierna, okay. They host 3 popular true crime podcasts, Missing Maura Murrary, Crawlspace, and Empty Frames. They'll talk about how their storytelling is sparking public interest to solve crime, especially cold cases. Missing Maura Murrary was the inspiration for the Oxygen Network's Disappearance of Maura Murray TV show. Empty Frames dives deep into the Boston's Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum art heist, as well as other art crimes. And Crawlspace covers a broad range of true crime cases and has done 10 episodes on the Brianna Maitland disappearance. And so we'll let you ask questions about that. We'll talk more about that as we move forward. So we have the safest place to be in Nashua right now. So we're going to kick this off with the first question. And why don't we'll bring this to Mark, and then others can chime in. Put you on the spot, Mark. You are the first one here, so you get the first question. Really, why would any of you be here talking about forensics tonight? Aren't you giving away like hints and secrets to people who might have criminal intentions that might want to learn more and how to cover their tracks?
No. Everybody sees TV. They know what's going on. Is that it? That's easy. No. There are no secrets anymore, really. And our technology is ever evolving. Most of our stuff goes through the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, for processing, which you can imagine is, not only stateside but internationally. So it takes some time sometimes to get it through the queue, as we call it, unless it's an emergency, like Boston Marathon bombing. Everything was taken down by vehicle and processed on the spot type of stuff. All of the cases took a back burner while that was going on.
You mentioned the FBI labs. How does New Hampshire do relative to forensic detection? Do we have labs here, or when do they send it out, and how do we do?
I'll leave that to Bob.
Okay.
So what they do, I can't speak specifically about the New Hampshire State Lab and the numbers and their turnover for all of their evidence that they get. But anytime we have evidence come in Nashua that's going to be forensically examined, with the exception of computer evidence, which we can examine in-house in Nashua, everything else is packaged and sent directly to the state lab in New Hampshire for processing, whether it be blood evidence or bodily fluid evidence for DNA, fingerprint evidence, all of our drug evidence. Everything is processed and analyzed by the lab up in Concord, and they are the sole lab for the state of New Hampshire. For anything that can't be handled by the lab, if there's certain types of examinations they cannot do, touch DNA, for example, is something they don't have the capability to process in New Hampshire, that will get sent out to a third-party commercial lab for those types of examinations.
What would it take to get the FBI in on a Maura Murrary case? What kind of evidence?
Well, the first thing, we have to have a nexus, right? A typical homicide is at a state level. There's no federal nexus to a homicide unless there's an interstate aspect to it. We have to have that interstate aspect. And we'll be looking to the local police department or they can ask us for help, and we do police cooperation that way, but would not be the first dog in the fight. We need the local police to ask for help, and we can offer our lab services if that's available, if they have something they can't do locally. Or we have to have an interstate nexus. They brought the body over the state lines, or the kidnapping happened. You saw recently there was a kidnapping like in the Manchester Mall and something, and then went across the line into Vermont, and then there was a chase down in Pennsylvania, because you're crossing all those state lines, and the FBI would have a dog in that fight.
Tell us, what does forensics mean to you, and how does it fit into your work?
I am a clinician. An ER physician is my full-time job, but I also have a second hat as a forensic examiner at Southern New Hampshire Medical Center's ER. When I take call for the forensics team, if the beeper goes off, that could be any one of a number of patient populations, but classically, in terms of the variety of forensics that I might have an opportunity to collect, that would be the sexual assault victim. So the state of New Hampshire has provided us with a standardized kit. I'm sure all states have their own version of the standardized kit, but this would be ours. And depending on the nature of the assault, there could be a wide variety of potential evidence to collect. Now, of course, you're still talking about a patient. Anyone that comes into the ER, regardless of what hat I'm wearing, is a patient. And the young woman or man in this question would have an opportunity for various options of collection, but that does not mean by any stretch of the imagination they are obligated to have their evidence collected. In the event they do wish to have their evidence collected, then, it's a very comprehensive exam. Depending on the nature of the assault, there could be a wide variety of biological material to collect, and then a lot of paperwork to document the collection after the fact. So that would be an example of, in the most general sense, of the kind of forensics that I do, but it's all within the context of the overall care of the patient.
So to transition, if someone were to go to the hospital, get a kit, and they were reporting that they were a victim of a crime, that's when we would get involved. Detective would go down. Usually an officer would collect the kit, preserve it as evidence, and then we would speak to that individual from there. So the forensics for us, I guess for the doctor, it's more like treating of the victim. For us, it's moving forward in the criminal process. What we get back from that kit, what's tagged as evidence, what's tested from there on, and how that can help us later on in the prosecution of a defendant in a case.
Hey there, I'm Tim. We just do podcasting, so we don't have any idea what forensics are. Forensic Files, I've seen that show. That's a really good show. So we've dipped our toe into getting some samples tested over the past year in regards to our work, but that's really where it ends.
I think another thing that's important for us is to establish a good working relationship with people who are in law enforcement, who's in forensics, and we're able to answer questions that we get from our listeners. We get a lot of questions like that gentleman's question about whether or not the FBI can or cannot come into a case, and how does that work. We get a lot of those questions, and sometimes we don't know how to answer them, and just establishing that relationship is super important for us to provide the right answer, just to give the people the information that they are asking for.
How long is the evidence kept? Is it a certain time after the case is solved, or once the case is solved, is it disposed of?
So at the Nashua Police Department right now, I can tell you we have just under 60,000 evidence items at the police department, and that runs the gamut of absolutely every item that you can possibly think of. We probably have at least one of in evidence. So we collect evidence for all different types of crimes, from violation level offenses to felony level offenses and homicides, and it depends on the type of case that we have for how long we keep the evidence. Homicide evidence is kept as long as the case is open. There's no statute of limitations for homicide cases. If the case is completed in court, it's been adjudicated. All appeals have been done. Homicide evidence can be disposed of with a judge's order only, and it's a line item order that's specific to homicide cases. Felony cases, those are held for the statute of limitations if it's an unsolved case. If it is a solved case and the case is adjudicated in court, whether it be by a plea trial or anything like that, once the plea is completed, or if it's a trial, once appeals are completed, the evidence will be disposed of then. Misdemeanor cases, it's 1 year, and same thing goes for misdemeanors as well. So we hold it as long as required for disposition of the case, but it becomes unwieldy if we have to hold on to evidence for extended periods of time, because we only have so much space, and obviously 60,000 is a lot. A few years ago, we're actually up over 100,000.
Wow.
So that's where we're at right now.
So does that have to be climate controlled space to preserve things?
Everything's indoor. It's all climate controlled. We do have refrigerators and freezers for evidence that needs to remain in cold storage. And then, depending on, because we're an accredited agency, how evidence is stored is pretty important. So we have different requirements for different types of evidence as well.
Thanks, everybody, for attending. My question is actually of personal interest. It's directed more to Dr. Karagosian and Sergeant Hannon. Returning back to possibly a little bit more in the Nashua Police, but returning back to the kits that you use and the reports that have happened. And this is, my narrow knowledge of reading things, so bear with me on that. But the rape kits having delays and the issues with not getting them through the process, and it's more of a, I guess this is more of an administrative question perhaps, but I've heard over and over again, particularly with college students, and how the campuses are involved with providing them with kits there, and then how it gets through perhaps to the emergency room, or perhaps they come in, and so many of them have been delayed, and therefore the process in the courtrooms are unable to move forward.
So in the process of my work with the Sexual Assault Advisory Board, that's probably quarterly meetings in Concord, New Hampshire, we get a chance to work directly with liaisons from the crime lab. I'm thinking specifically of Kevin McMahon. And I don't, I mean, I hate to speak outside my area, but I don't believe from his perspective we have a significant backlog in New Hampshire, actually. In the state of New Hampshire, for a kit to be processed, it has to be a reported kit. So what that means is that when a victim comes forward, they have a choice to either have their evidence collected anonymously with their name off of it, which means, of course, the evidence is still stored exactly the same way as a reported kit, but it is not processed. We probably at Southern see a fair amount of kit go under anonymous collection. Now, they have the option to report any time after that, but to the extent to which an anonymous will convert to a reported, that's not information that I would be aware of. I would defer to my Nashua police colleagues for that. I'm trying to think of anything else to say. From our perspective, I would say biologic evidence on the body degrades over time. So for a kit to be collected at all, regardless of how it's collected, depending on the nature of assault, you have up to 5 days to present to a medical forensic location. And this is probably just a quick shout out for the expertise of the SANE nurse. I did ask one of my crime lab colleagues, who I won't name at this point, but I asked him how many of these kits are collected by a nurse with forensic training. Because in the state of New Hampshire, and I'm sure many other states are like this, I only practice in New Hampshire, I can only speak about New Hampshire, you do not have to have any forensic training whatsoever to collect a sexual assault kit in New Hampshire. And if I were going to just guess as to how many are collected by a medical provider with any forensic training whatsoever, I'd say it's about half. So when I think of where my concerns are in terms of what's happening out there to this evidence, I would say it starts much earlier than the processing step. I would say it starts with who's collecting it in the first place. Because, I mean, if this is opened at any point in time, I think you will be impressed with exactly how much paperwork pours out of Pandora's box, and it can be really overwhelming to just even so much as keep it organized. That if this is the first time they're working with it in the context of a victim, then it's just the best advertisement for getting more sane nurse-trained individuals out there and practicing that I could possibly think of.
Do programs or podcasts like that ever cause problems for law enforcement vis-a-vis, for example, people creating conspiracy theories or their own theories of a crime?
I haven't had any issue. I mean, I enjoyed the Bear Brook one. Someone mentioned that. I like podcasts, so I'll probably jump on with these guys shortly. So no, I haven't seen any issue with it. I'm sure there might be some issue out there, and but it's good dialogue. Any dialogue is good dialogue, especially so if it brings up new things and gets people working in the right direction, I don't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah, for us, we always welcome calls with information. Do we get conspiracy theorists? Oh God, yeah. We have to do what's called complaint duty. For a week straight, you get stuck in the office, or even if you're in the field, all the calls for the state of New Hampshire that go to the FBI will funnel to you at all hours of the night. And there's some people out there that think Martians are landing in the backyard and things like that. Yeah, I get those calls. You have to entertain them, and there are other ones where I can think of one recently, where this person thought a government agency, wouldn't say what, was sending radio waves into their head and having conversations with them. Will we get those? Yeah. But, the podcast, if somebody's hearing something like that and, it rings a bell to them or brings up a memory and they call us, yeah, we'll act on it. After 9/11, right, Director Mueller took the position that no lead will go uncovered, right? So even if you call in with a crazy complaint, it's going to get documented. It may go to what we call a zero file, where nothing's going to be done, but that call is going to be documented with as much detail as we can get.
We've been working with the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit, and we've pretty rapidly figured out that we're sort of a catch-all, and we've been told, we've had live shows, and we've been told, hey, can you give us the list of the people that are coming to your live show, just so that they can, maybe there's something that stands out there. We've also been told that they listen to the podcast, so maybe there's a guest on, so we've been told that they adapt to the time. So if it means, I really think that law enforcement has got tips that are crazy, incredible since the inception of law enforcement. And it just happens that podcasting is now the certain media conduit before it gets to them. We got letters, we forward it off to the cold case unit, and they laugh, they kind of chuckle, and they say, we get thousands of these, so if we can help a little bit by alleviating that, then I think, I'm good to do that.
Next question here in the center.
I wonder if the panel might take this opportunity individually at this time to give us an example of a wow moment or an observed dumbass moment, depending on how you look at it, on a case that you might have been on or very familiar with, personally involved in, that you realized at that moment, in whatever time it was, that forensic science actually pushed the case one way or the other.
Sandy had mentioned in the intro, cold case Anthony Barnaby and David Capelin had murdered 2 women on 7 Mason Street back in 1988. I wasn't the lead detective then. I was in first grade class at the moment. But it got reopened in 2010. I was at the PD. I didn't know much about it. And then I got assigned in 2015. But Frank Bourgeois, who was the sergeant in detectives at the time, took a look at the case. He went to a cold case seminar and said, wow, maybe some cases we can look at. There's new advancements in forensics and DNA testing. So the sexual assault kit comes into play because back in 1988, it was a brutal murder. There was no signs of sexual assault per se, but luckily the medical examiner was smart enough to, the way he saw it, let's do a sexual assault kit just in case. Fast forward to 2010, reopen the case, new advancements. They end up getting the defendant because his DNA was in the swabs. The oral and vaginal swab came back positive for his DNA. So they had been tried 3 times, one of them back in 1988, all hung juries for the next, however many years. And then back in 2011, they were rearrested. And then recently, in this past summer, both were convicted in that homicide. So that was definitely a wow moment and a good job for not only the preservation of the evidence, but the collection of it at the time.
I'm going to have to take a little liberty with your question. I hope you don't mind, because we don't frequently get to hear about the result of the forensic evidence we collect. So steering this just a little bit from the perspective of a clinician, we, as was in my intro, we see probably on the order of about 100 sexual assaults. Not all of them necessarily get a kit in any given year. And I'm a part of a 6-person team, so a certain percentage of them are mine. Fortunately, not all of them are mine. I will tell you, one of the reasons I got into this and continue to do this, I've probably been a forensic examiner myself since 2014. From an ER doctor's perspective, we get to see a patient for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. You guys have probably had this experience personally if you've been to an ER anytime in the recent past. When you work with a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence, you are working with them for a period of hours, 9 times out of 10. It's a very different relationship. And you get to see a trajectory from when they first come in to when they leave. And the potential to make an impact during this clinical encounter is, it really can't be stated. One of the reasons I do this is, yes, I'm very much a fan of forensic science, but to what extent that patient has a healing experience in my department while they are receiving their care is much more fundamental, obviously, from my background. And this is where I just want to plug an organization that is not a part of this panel, but is very near and dear to my heart, and that is Bridges. They're the local crisis advocacy center that provides support services to victims of domestic and sexual violence. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Don, you should take a bow. But thanks to this agency, these people who come to us, oftentimes with one of the goals being forensic collection, are put on a path of healing and have an opportunity to work very in-depth at that clinical encounter with the advocate. I know I'm probably completely derailing your question. I apologize. But it is sometimes I think of the kit as the vector by which they get a chance to work with the advocate and really recover from the trauma in question.
Yeah, certainly a case that stands out in my mind that really got me involved in digital forensics. Back about 2010, I was a juvenile detective, and I started working with the New Hampshire Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, the ICAC Task Force, and we continue to work with them up to this day. And they work throughout the state, investigating crimes involving children on the internet, child exploitation, child pornography, those type of things. And when I was juvenile detective, I was just getting into technology-related investigations, and we had a case here in Nashua where a parent was exploiting their two of his daughters and videotaping them, and a cyber tip through the Crimes Against Children Task Force led us to this house in Nashua. And at the time, these were twin daughters. They happened to be I had twin daughters. They were less than a year old at the time, so it really struck home with me as far as the case went. And we were able to execute a search warrant at the house. Took a lot of digital evidence away from the house that we examined after the fact, and we were able to convict this gentleman on federal child pornography manufacturing charges, and he's still in jail to this day on those charges. So it was pretty gratifying as far as that goes, but that really got me to enjoy digital forensics, and really made me like it.
As Sandy mentioned earlier, probably the easiest one for me to explain is a case I did way back in the 90s called the Florida 4. It was based out of South Florida. A lot of you guys are youngsters, but back then in the 90s, there were some problems going on in Northern Ireland. I don't know how much any of you folks know about that. And they did something called the Good Friday Agreement. And part of that agreement was that the IRA was to decommission their weapons. And the ballistics from a bunch of homicides could track back to weapons that they had stored out in the countryside and whatnot. So they were turning in their guns as part of this peace process deal with all the parties involved. But what was not known at the time was they were restocking with new weapons from the United States. And they were purchasing them down in South Florida. They had an operation running where they had a guy named Anthony Smith and Siobhan Brown doing what they call straw purchases of firearms, and eventually they found some dirty dealers that would sell them some weapons without filling out the proper ATF forms if they gave them some sort of a bribe. So Anthony Siobhan buying the guns, and then from Northern Ireland comes a guy named Connor Claxon, who self-admits to being an intelligence officer for the IRA. At that time, the IRA was a terrorist organization. So he comes over, and he's the ringleader of this organization, and his job is to collect the guns from those other two, give them some money, but also buy used equipment, computer towers, toys from Toys R Us, other things like that, and then he'd strip out the guts of these things and load them with handguns and ammunition and whatnot, package them up, and advertise, put something on the customs declaration, Christmas present, birthday gift, whatever it may be. And then he had another gentleman from Northern Ireland named Martin Mullen. I can tell you all the names because they all got convicted of this stuff. Martin Mullen would come down from Philadelphia and pick up the packages. So when we took this operation down, we worked with MI5, which is the British Intelligence Service, Scotland Yard, and the Garda. And some of the packages did get through. Some got stopped in West Midlands Airport, and some got stopped in South Florida. Martin Mullen's defense during this thing was he was just asked to pick up some packages, didn't know what was in them, and just dropped them off at the post office as he was requested to do. In Connor Claxon's apartment, when we hit that with a search warrant, one of the things that didn't seem significant at the time was just a roll of duct tape, but it had a tear at the end, right? And there was, I'm going to say now off the top of my head, 30 some odd packages that had been shipped that we had recovered. The people in the crime lab at FBI headquarters or in Quantico were able to take that tape and lay out all 37 packages in the sequence they were packaged. And on top of that, they were fairly careful with gloves and whatnot when they were packaging this stuff up. But what they did is they packaged it up in Martin Mullen's hotel room when he was staying in West Palm Beach, Florida. So when they're putting the tape on these packages, it's picking up, they didn't know at the time, carpet fibers. And then when they're putting the packages in, the towers and the toys, believe it or not, they're picking up little bits of fiber off the carpet, and they're, putting it in the package, and he ships it off. So when we get the the fibers off the inside of the tape and inside the packages. Martin Mullen's defense collapsed because he couldn't say he didn't know what was inside the packages because we had taken a sample. We went back and looked at his records, and by the time we got him, he was back in Philly, right? Went back, found the hotel he was at, went back, found the exact room, and then went and got a piece of carpeting from that room. And we were able to match the carpet fibers from inside that room to all the packages he had mailed, and his defense went out the window. And then, for me, the scary part of that whole thing, it was great. The forensics people at Quantico did a great job, but that was my first experience where politics really became a major factor in the case, because I'll never forget the surreal call I got when I was with MI5, doing something out in the field, and I got called back to the main office to meet the big boss in Florida. That we call him the special agent in charge, the SIC. He was Hector Pesquera at the time. And he tells me, I go in the room, it's never a good thing. I don't know, you guys work in corporate world, right? But you go in, the president's there, the vice presidents and legal counsel's in there. They're all in this room. And I'm like, this is not good, right? And I'm like, uh-oh. And it got worse because he says, see the blinking line? He says, that's Director Free on the line waiting for an answer from you. And he asked me a certain question. I said, never happened, boss. Because he's like, the administration at the time, because it was such a sensitive thing going on at the time, they wanted us to drop the whole case. They wanted to be dropped, but obviously the law enforcement people getting killed overseas with these guns didn't. And a guy named Sandy Berger at the time, he's now dead. They were at one point telling me I was going to get transferred to San Juan, Puerto Rico if I kept pushing it. But thankfully, Louis Free, stood up to that and says, what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong, and we're going forward with the case. But that was my surreal moment.
We kind of have a podcast version of that duct tape story.
We were inside a house in the Maura Murrary case that's commonly referred to as the Aframe house. And if you've seen the TV show The Disappearance of Maura Murrary, there was some blood found in a closet downstairs on the wall, but apparently it was too diluted to come up with an actual profile. So we were invited by the owners to go back, and we had a pretty professional company with us, and so we we took wall scrapings, and we handed them over to the cold case unit that day. And a couple of weeks later, they called us, and so that was kind of a crazy moment, a wow moment, as the question asked, because we could have heard something other than this evidence has no evidentiary value, but we didn't know what we were going to hear at the time. But so at this point, the Aframe house seems like it's not related whatsoever to Maura's case.
We were led to this house through the information that we had heard through private investigator organizations that cadaver dogs were in the house and they went bonkers. So we just learned a whole lot through this, and we had it in our head that when cadaver dogs hit on an area where someone was dead, then they go bonkers, because that was just the only information we had. But by working with law enforcement and actually working with the cadaver dogs and with ground penetrating radar companies, and just throughout the course of those relationships, cadaver dogs don't go bonkers. They sit down. They do the exact opposite of bonkers. So what we learned there, and that was kind of the aha moment, was that this is how it actually works. It's not what we've heard, and we're able to filter out sort of the noise that came along with it.
So the question is for digital forensics. There's a number of different platforms out there. Could you speak to which is the easiest to get the data from and which is the hardest? I'm thinking Windows, Linux, Mac, Chromebook, iOS, Android. Purely intellectual curiosity. I have no other plans.
So I'm going to tell you the answer that I tell every detective that comes and asks me, hey, what evidence can you get me out of this? It depends. It truly does depend on all the facts, circumstances surrounding that particular evidence. Just purely from a commercial perspective, there's more tools available to get information out of Windows machines. So that makes that makes our lives a little bit easier as digital examiners. But there are plenty of tools that that work with Mac, that work with Linux. Those are both paid commercial tools, and there's free tools out there that we can use. But when it comes to getting evidence off, in encryption, we find that everywhere now. It's been in Unix, Linux systems for a very, very long time. It was in Mac, and now, in the latest Windows releases, you see BitLocker. But it all depends on, what's being used on the devices that were seized. Whether they're using any type of encryption, any what type of password protection they have on certain things, and that goes for cell phones as well. We heard back with the FBI in the San Bernardino case. Obviously, that was huge news as far as Apple helping, Apple refusing to help them get into that phone. Obviously, there was a private company that ended up assisting them doing that. But there's a lot more commercial tools now that allow us to get through certain types of password protection through certain types of encryption. And then in the future we're going to see quantum computing and that kind of stuff blow away all the encryption that we have right now. So the short answer again is it depends. It depends on the stuff that we're getting.
I have a two-part question. For everyone other than Tim and Lance, who I adore, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm not deliberately excluding you, but everyone who deals with this on a day-to-day basis, what do you do in terms of self-care to make yourselves able to put yourselves in these horrible situations and care for these other people so deeply and still make sure you're okay? And then my second part is Tim and Lance, who I adore. You guys are great. Like you've done an amazing thing, and it's not even well, come on. It's not even your thing. You've done an amazing thing. Like, how has this changed your life?
Let's touch on a couple of things that the Nashua Police Department does. Several years ago, we implemented a unit within our police department in conjunction with some other law enforcement agencies, which is the CIMT, which is the Critical Incident Management Team, and that's essentially a peer support group for law enforcement that are involved in any type of critical incident. So that's something that's available to us. Also, recently working with the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, those the guys and girls in that field look at some pretty horrible imagery on almost a daily basis. I know the guys in Nashua end up having to do that kind of stuff too, and it certainly shows to take a toll on you mentally, looking at abused children day in and day out. And the ICAC programs nationwide are really going out of their way to get officers and detectives into mental health training, and we've recently had a couple of those here in New Hampshire for that. But to answer your question, what do I do at the end of the day to decompress? I go home and I hug my kids, and that makes it easy.
This level of intensity, you're always going to, I think, struggle with that to a certain degree. I do not have kids to hug, so I cannot state that as an option. That's very cool. My significant other, who is not here, is a trained sommelier, so I will say that our wine collection is quite good. Everything in moderation, however.
Yeah, I was going to say bad day Kettle One, really bad day whiskey. That's typically how it goes. But no, I mean, you got to talk to the people that went through it with you. The CIMT program has been great. And then just going back to family, and just there's certain cases that will always stick with you. They're always in the back of your mind. And there's certainly triggers for those. So when you get those triggers, you just talk to family and get through it that way.
I don't think we have the stressful schedule that these gentlemen do, right? Typically, we're working Monday through Friday, day shifts. We're not out there at 2 in the morning. We're not going to domestic violences. We're not rolling around on the street with a DWI. Those are my old days, right? We're more, into a deep, long-term investigations. That being said, obviously, we have a lot of undercover agents that go on long-term assignments, and part of and I'm not one of them, okay, because I couldn't do what I do. Most people here in the city, I think, know me. Those folks have regularly scheduled meetings with professional doctors that, are not local. The FBI has this thing where they don't want you to go see somebody in the local area just in case there's a connection, right? So if I'm working undercover, I may have to fly to Chicago, and I'll spend 2 or 3 days there in Chicago talking to the shrink out there, and just make sure that I'm okay. If I'm in Chicago, I may have to go to Atlanta and spend 2 or 3 days. It's a regularly scheduled maintenance checkup on those undercovers. And then, obviously, if you have EAP issues, you go see EAP counselor. They can arrange those same type of things for you. Me, myself, I've been doing this for so long now, 32 years. It's just like, riding a bike, I guess.
Sure, thank you very much. Yeah, these projects have changed our lives in a lot of ways. I used to probably get, text messages from old buddies in high school and things like that, but that has kind of faded away over the past few years and has been replaced with text messages from private investigators and things like that. We also just try to keep it light as well in the office. But there's also a volunteer element to what we do that we've never experienced before. And I would say that has changed our lives.
Like Tim said, we've actually seen people do this on their own, other true crime bloggers or podcasters, and they go about it on their own. And we've had people contact us and they dip their toe in for a second and then they're like, oh, damn. And what Tim and I have is just the ability to bounce it off of each other. If we see something that is particularly disturbing to us, or a family member has just given us an account of something that is just almost unlistenable, then we get off the phone and we can go back and forth. So we're our own sort of support group. But he's right. A few years ago, I was organizing private parties and getting permits to build tents, and now we're talking to Chuck Westberson on this panel, for God's sake. Like it is very surreal, and it does take a little bit of self-reflection at the end of the day.
Okay, next question, right in the center of the room in the back at the bar here.
I have a question about cold cases. I know Tim and Lance mentioned working with the New Hampshire cold case unit. Are those handled on a state level? Is there city level cold case? How do they decide which cases are worth opening back up again? Is it simply because maybe new technology or a family member points to something, or how do they decide on that?
I don't really know. I think they have a certain amount on their website. It is run through the state, through the Attorney General's office, Department of Justice, and so that they have a list of the cold cases on the site. I'm not sure how they choose though, or if every case that is unsolved gets there eventually.
Yeah, I think they have a file as much as they can on every case, and I know that they just hired a few more people to work in the cold case unit. I don't know if that's something that the cold case unit would ever tell us. Like, oh, here's why this case is prioritized over this case.
So I can talk on that a little bit. So for us, because we're a bigger department, we hold all of our cold cases, but we work in conjunction with the cold case unit. So for the Canada homicide, 1988 homicide, we reopened it, but we worked hand in hand with the state police on that. Not state police detectives more, but more the Attorney General's office, who oversees the cold case unit. So what they do is, without speaking for them, they do need to prioritize. They do go through all the cold cases. The smaller towns, they kind of take those cases on. If there's a homicide in a small town, the state police would take it over anyway. So if it becomes a cold case, they're overseeing that. So based upon new developments in technology or a witness comes forward, that's how they would prioritize those. But they do have a handle on all of the cold cases out there.
Everybody's doing these Ancestry.com DNA kits and 23andMe, and we're starting to hear about how some crimes are being solved using these kits. How do they play into what you do? Are they actually admissible? Are they useful? Are you looking at them?
I can tell you in Nashua, no, that's honestly the first I've heard of that. But we haven't had anything in Nashua where we've had any DNA crime solved through any third party commercial vendors like that. But it's certainly an interesting prospect. I mean, just like any other any other case or cold case, if there's something out there that generates a lead, we're certainly going to follow up on it. As far as its admissibility in court, I don't know that those waters have been tested anywhere, so I'm not sure about that. But we haven't seen that anywhere yet. But it's a certainly interesting prospect, and we'd certainly go forward if there was something that led us down that road.